Hi everyone. In this bite-sized bit, we're going to continue our discussion of implementing a multiple form design in a C# program. Last time we created two forms. We created a customer form and a payment form. Now we're ready to start programming these forms. I'm going to start with the payment form first, and I'll walk you through the various methods I'm going to design for this form, and then we'll walk through the programming for the customer form. First thing we're going to do for the payment form is we're going to write some code for when the form loads, and you would get to that method by double-clicking on your form object on your screen. Let's talk through the code that I have written for my load method for my payment form. The first thing that I do is I load up my list box with the appropriate names of credit cards. So you can see I'm doing an LST credit card type .items.add, and I added Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover. Feel free to add other credit cards if you'd like. After adding my choices, I do an LST credit card type .selected index is equal to 0. That means that the first item on the list box, in our case Visa, will be automatically pre-selected for the user when this form is loaded. The next thing I do in my load method is I create an array of months. I start with the phrase select a month ... and then I list all of my months in abbreviated format. I'm going to use this array to load the combo box that stores the expiration months on my form. So I'm going to use a for each loop. I'm going to pull each month entry from the str months array one at a time, and I'm going to use the .items.add method for the combo box month to add each one of those entries. After I've added each entry, I'm going to automatically select the first choice, which is the select a month ... phrasing. Next, I'm going to populate my year combo box. And the way I'm going to do so is first by figuring out what today's year is. When I'm recording this video, it's 2020. So today's year is going to be 2020. My end year is going to be 8 years from now. So I'm going to add 8 to today's year. The first entry I'm going to have in my year combo box is select a year ... And then I'm going to use a while loop to move from year to year to year until I reach my end year, and I'm going to add each one of those years as a string value to my combo box. And finally, I'm going to automatically select the very first entry, select a year ... in this combo box. The next thing that I'm going to do is write some of my own user-defined methods. And the first one I'm going to write is a private method for this form. It's going to have a return type Boolean, so it's going to return a true or a false, and its name is isValidData. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to validate this form. Because this form doesn't have any standard text boxes per se, I'm going to write some custom validation. The first thing I'm going to do in this method is check to see if the user chose the option of credit card. So I'm checking to see if RDO credit card .checked is true or not. And in this particular location, if you wanted to type == true, you can. If you don't type that, it's automatically going to evaluate the value of .checked as true or false and proceed accordingly. If the user has chosen credit card as their option, I have some follow-up questions I need to ask. I need to check if they have not yet chosen a credit card type. So if their selected index was equal to -1, they haven't chosen a credit card type, and I would want to put up a message box that says you need to choose a credit card type, focus on that control, and return a false. The second possibility is that they have not typed in a credit card number. So after trimming the text property of that credit card, if it's empty, I'm going to tell the user you need to enter a credit card number, focus on that text box, and return a false. The last question I'm going to ask is if the combo box for the month and the combo box for the year are equal to either 0 or less than 0, which would be a -1. That means the user either hasn't chosen anything in those combo boxes, or they've left the select a month ... or select a year ... as their choices. If any of that is true, I'm going to warn the user they need to enter a valid expiration date. I'm going to highlight the month combo box, and I'm going to return a false. If the user managed to satisfy all three of those if statements, I'm then going to return a true, which means they've entered all their credit card information correctly. If the user did not choose credit card as an option, if they chose bill to customer, there's nothing to validate. So all I'm going to do is return a true. The second user-defined method that I'm going to write is private. It does not have a return type, so its return type is void, and the name of it is save data. In this case, I'm going to create a message that I want to report to the user after I've successfully saved the data. Now, in this particular example, we don't actually save anything to any place external. All we're going to do is create a message that's going to be reported to our parent form, in this case, the customer form. So I'm going to start with an empty string variable, str message. And then if the user has chosen credit card payment as their option, I'm going to build a message that says charge to credit card. I'm going to add to that card type and a colon, and then I'm going to add the actual card type they chose in my list box. I'm going to add to that the card number, colon, and the number they typed in the text box. And then I'm going to add expiration, colon, the month they chose, and I'm using selected index because it will be 1 through 12 for January through December, which is clever. And then I'm adding to that a /, and then I'm adding to that the year's text that they chose in the combo box. If the user chose to bill the customer, the message is going to include just the words bill to customer. Finally, regardless of what the user chose in terms of their payment options, I'm going to add the phrase default billing method and either the word true or false, depending on whether they checked the default checkbox or not. The last part of this method handles how we're going to get this information from one form to another. And there are lots of ways of doing this, but in this particular example, what we're going to do is use the .tag property to move information from one form to another. This .tag is the tag for the overall payment form, and I'm setting that property equal to my str message variable. Then I am setting the dialog result for this entire form equal to the value OK. And we'll talk a little bit about how this form is going to be displayed on the screen and what this dialog result.OK actually accomplishes a little later in this example. Returning to the visualization of my form, I'm going to write some code for my two buttons. For my cancel button, I'm actually not going to type any additional code behind the scenes, but I am going to change one of its properties. Specifically, I'm going to change its dialog result property to cancel. And the reason for that is going to become apparent a little bit later in this video. For the OK button, I do need to write some additional code. After double-clicking on my OK button, I wrote if is valid data, and if the answer is true, I'm activating the save data method. So I wrote those two user-defined methods already. Now I am using them. I'm checking to see if the user entered appropriate information on this form. If they did, I'm going to save a message which I'm going to report back to my customer form. The last bit of code I'm going to write for this form has to do with my two radio buttons. And because they're only two, when one is chosen, the other is automatically not chosen, and vice versa. So I'm going to write code for one of the two radio buttons, and it will actually work whenever the user clicks on one or the other of these two radio buttons. If I double click on my radio button for credit card, the default method associated with that radio button is RDO credit card _ check changed. So we're checking to see if the condition of that radio button has changed or not. In this case, if the user has chosen credit card, I'm going to turn on the entire credit card group box. Otherwise, I'm going to turn it off. So this .enabled true or .enabled false is going to either enable or disable the controls inside the credit card group box. Looking back at our visualization, think about what that accomplishes. If the user chooses bill to customer, the group box that contains the credit card type, the credit card number, and the expiration combo boxes will be disabled. So all of the controls inside that group box will also be disabled, unavailable for the user to manipulate. If the user chooses credit card in the billing group box, then the credit card group box gets enabled, and the user then can choose the appropriate credit card type, number, and expiration. This is a clever way of enabling or disabling many controls on our form. Alternatively, you could change the group box's .visible property on or off to hide all of those controls all at once. Now that we're done programming the payment form, let's go ahead and tackle our customer form. Before I write any code for this form, I am going to create a global variable. This variable is going to be type Boolean. It's going to be a true or a false. It's going to be called bool is data saved, and it starts with the default value of true. We're going to use this variable to track whether or not the user has made any changes to the program. When the user does make changes to the program, we're going to flip this variable from true to false. And then we're going to check to see if the variable is equal to false before we let the user leave the form or close the program. You've seen this kind of logic in action when you have worked on various programs on your computer. So for instance, right now I've made some changes to my program and I haven't saved them yet. If I tried to close Visual Studio, I would get this prompt. Do you want to save changes to the following items? And I could answer yes or no or cancel. Visual Studio is paying attention to the fact that I've made changes but I haven't clicked the save button yet, and it's warning me before I try to close the program. Visual Studio also has this nice feature of adding a little asterisk next to tabs that haven't been saved, and I really like that feature, so I'm going to show you how we can add that to our form. The first method that I'm going to write is for the form load, so I'm going to double click on my customer form. If this were an actual full-fledged program, what our customer load would probably do is get information from some sort of external data source. So we get our customers from a database or a website or a spreadsheet. We're not ready to do that quite yet, so I'm just making up a couple of names and populating our customer name combo box with those made up names. I'm adding Mike Smith and Nancy Jones. Please feel free to add any other names. This is just a substitute for what would really happen, which is adding actual customer names to our form. Just like in the payment form, I am going to write some user-defined methods on my customer form. I'm going to write an isValidData method, and even though it has the exact same name as the method I wrote for our payment form, this one is private to our customer form, and it's obviously different. For validation for this form, I'm going to make sure that the user chooses one of the customer names from our combo box, and I'm going to make sure that the label for payment has text inside of it. This is an interesting validation because the only way that this label is going to be populated is if the user has gone to the payment form and completed it, and the payment form has sent information back to our customer form. So it's basically checking to see if they've used the secondary form or not. If they haven't, they get warned and they get returned to the form so that they can manipulate it. If the user has chosen a customer and filled out their payment information, then validation will return a true. For my save data method, in the real world, we'd be taking the information about the customer and their payment and we'd be storing it someplace externally. And then we would be resetting our form to get it ready for the next entry. We're not actually saving anything externally. We just have to imagine that that's happening. But we are going to get the form ready for the next data entry. And this is an important lesson, particularly in our class. When you are done with a specific iteration of your program, you need to get the program ready for the next iteration. So if I've collected order information from a customer and I'm done with a particular order, I need to reset the form to be ready for the next customer to call. If I've entered new product information and I've saved it, I need to get the form ready for the next product to be entered. When you are creating methods that would normally save to some sort of external source, the second function of that method is to reset your interface so that it is ready for the next data entry. And that's what we're doing here. I am resetting the combo box's customer name selected index to -1, which means I'm not choosing a default customer. I'm leaving it empty. I'm clearing the text in my LBL payment. I'm resetting my isDataSaved Boolean to true. I'm changing the text of my form to the word customer. And then I'm putting the cursor inside the combo box for my customer name. I'm basically focusing on that control. For my save button, it looks exactly the same as the save button for my payment form. I ask if the data is valid, and if it is, I run the save data method. I'm going to write one more method that I'm going to associate with a couple of different controls on my form. So I'm writing this method, private void data changed, and I'm adding the parameters object sender and event args e. When this method is triggered, it's going to do two things. The first thing it's going to do is it's going to change the value of my isDataSaved Boolean variable to false. And the second thing it's going to do is it's going to change the text of this form to customer asterisk. Let's think about what's happening here. This method is going to be triggered when the user has made some sort of change to the customer form. When they make that change, I want to visually indicate to the user that you've edited information on the form but not yet saved it. And that's what the changing of the text property of the form is doing. Just like my tabs right now have asterisks next to them because I haven't saved my work. If I save my tabs, the asterisks go away. And we're going to do something similar for our user. In save data, when we successfully save and reset the form, the text property for our form is reset to customer without the asterisk. They've saved their information. There's no reason to have that additional asterisk to indicate unsaved work. The other thing that's happening when our data is changed is we're changing the Boolean value of isDataSaved to false, and we're going to use that variable in a later method to warn the user if they try to exit the program or change something in the program that they have unsaved work and they might want to save it first. I'm going to associate that specific method with two different controls on my form. The first one I'm going to associate it with is the combo box for my customer name. So I'm coming over to Properties, and I'm clicking on my lightning bolt button for events, and I'm going to associate that method with my select index changed. If the user chooses a different customer in this combo box, then they've changed something, and that means I want to change the Boolean variable to false and put a little asterisk next to my customer title at the top of my form. The second form control I'm going to associate the data changed method with is my label LBL payment. And the trigger event I want to associate with is when the text inside this label is changed. That's going to happen when the user successfully enters payment information. And when they've done that, that means the data on this form has changed, and I want to flip the Boolean to false, and I want to put an asterisk next to the word customer. The code for my exit button is trivial. I just run the close method. Nothing exciting going on here. The code for my select payment button, however, does have some new and interesting things happening. So let's talk through this code. The very first line is form payment form is equal to new FRM payment. This is going to instantiate a new version of the FRM payment class. FRM payment is a class that we created when we created our payment form. And I'm going to use it to create a new version of that form and store it in an object called payment form. So this is how we're going to create a second form from our first form. We basically created the template for the payment form when we designed it, but this code is actually going to cause it to show up on our screen. And we want this particular payment form to show up on the screen in a particular format. We want it to be a show dialog. The alternative would be show. Show dialog has some additional features that are not normal for forms. A show dialog means that the form that shows up takes complete control of your program. You can't click away from it, and you can't do anything else until you've dealt with that specific form. So for example, when I get this dialog box warning me about saving my work, if I try to click away from it and go back to my program, you can see that it's blinking because it's saying you have to deal with me first. We're going to create a payment form that acts exactly the same way. You have to deal with the payment form before you can get back to the customer form. The other thing that show dialog does for us is it expects a response, and we're going to capture that response from the secondary form and do something interesting with that result. And we see that in our if statement. The dialog result has an object name selected button, and it receives the response from the payment form. We can ask what that response actually is. If the response was dialog result.OK, that means the user successfully entered payment information on the payment form, and we can do something with their response. Let's go back to our payment form for just a moment to refresh our memory on how we might get a dialog result.OK. Recall the very last two lines of the save data method on our payment form. We set the tag of this form equal to strMessage, and then we set the dialog result to dialog result.OK. When this form successfully saves its information, it's responding back to the previous form, in our case the customer form, with the OK result. And then we can do something with that when we are in the customer form itself. The way we're responding to an OK result from the payment form is to change the text property of our payment label to the tag that we stored in our payment form, which we're converting to string so that we can appropriately display it. So whatever the user actually entered on the payment form, we're going to display in the payment label on our customer form. I do want to create one more method which is associated with a trigger event for our form, but it is not the default behavior for our form. The default trigger event for our form is form load, and we've already written that particular method. And we'd get to it, or author it, by double-clicking on the form. But I want to write a method for a different trigger event for our form. Specifically, I'm interested in the form closing method. Not form closed, but form closing. Imagine that the user wants to close the customer form. Before they accomplish that goal, I want my code to interrupt and check to see if they should be allowed to do so. So I'm going to write some code for form closing by finding this particular trigger event in my lightning bolt area for the form and clicking on the Enter key on my keyboard. And that will open up a blank form closing method in my code base. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to ask if the isDataSaved Boolean variable is false. That would mean that there's unsaved data on the form, and that would mean that I need to potentially interrupt the user's action and see if they really want to exit the form or not. The next thing I'm going to do is ask the user, do you want to save your work? I'm asking them with a message box, but unlike how we've used message boxes in the past, I'm going to capture the message box's result in a dialog result object called button. I'm also changing the buttons that show up in the message box to yes, no, cancel, not the normal OK. And I'm changing the icon in our message box to a warning. After the user receives a message box that says, do you want to save your work? I'm going to capture their response, and if they answer yes, I'm going to attempt to validate their information. And if I'm successful, I'm going to save their information, which we know won't actually save anything, but it will reset the form for the next entry. If we try to save their work and the validation fails, I have this line here that says e.cancel equals true. What this does is it prevents the form from closing. So the user tried to close the customer form. They then tried to save their work. The work wasn't savable. So rather than closing the program, we kick the door back open and we leave the form on the screen for the user to fix whatever mistake they might have made. If the user chooses cancel on the message box, that means that they do not want to exit the customer form. They've changed their mind. Similarly to if I try to close Visual Studio right now, and instead of answering yes or no to either save my work or discard my work, I cancel, it kicks me back to Visual Studio. So again, if they click cancel on the message box, e.cancel is going to be equal to true, and we leave the customer form on the screen. If the user answers no, so the dialog result .no is what they chose, I don't write any code. That means that the form should close as per usual. So form closing won't actually do anything, and the customer form will close, and everything will proceed as per usual. So you don't see any actual code here, but I added a comment just to remind us what's happening. At this point, this program is complete and ready to test. I could certainly walk through the program with you again. I'm not going to do that. If I were writing this program, I would be using breakpoint analysis to watch all of the various components of the code and watch how it progresses from one form to another and back again. Again, I'm not going to demonstrate that in this video, but I strongly encourage you to use breakpoint analysis to explore how this program operates behind the scenes. That's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.